In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles on June 28, 1919, German delegates signed the treaty that formally ends the First World War. Article 231 of that treaty assigns sole responsibility for the war to Germany and its allies. The War Guilt Clause, as it becomes known, forces Germany to accept blame for a conflict that killed 17 million people, devastated Europe, destroyed 4 empires, and created the conditions for an even more terrible war 20 years later. But among the German delegates signing that treaty, among the bitter survivors of a conflict they believe Germany did not start alone, a question circulates in whispers. Is Bismarck responsible for this? Did the man who unified Germany through 3 calculated wars, who built the alliance system that kept Europe at peace for 2 decades, who warned repeatedly that Germany must never fight a 2-front war, somehow create the conditions that made this catastrophe inevitable? The question is more complex than it appears. Otto von Bismarck died in 1898, 16 years before the war began. He had been out of power for 8 years before his death, dismissed by a young emperor who wanted to rule without the domineering presence of the Iron Chancellor. Bismarck never lived to see the war he predicted, never saw the alliance system he built collapse into the rigid confrontation between armed camps that transformed a Balkan assassination into a global conflict. Yet his shadow falls across the July crisis of 1914 like a dark pall. The choices he made in 1871, the system he constructed afterward, the decisions about what Germany would be and how it would interact with Europe, all these reverberate through the decades and help shape the catastrophe that follows. To understand whether Bismarck bears responsibility for the First World War, one must examine 3 elements of his legacy: the wound he created through the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, the alliance system he built to manage the consequences of German unification, and the way that system collapsed when handled by lesser men. The wound is inflicted on May 10, 1871, when the Treaty of Frankfurt formally ends the Franco-Prussian War. Germany demands and receives Alsace and most of Lorraine, approximately 5,000 square miles of French territory, home to 1.5 million people. The annexation is controversial from the moment it is proposed. During the war, Bismarck himself had doubts about the wisdom of taking French territory. His diplomatic instinct told him that a humiliated France nursing territorial grievances would be a permanent enemy, that the wise course was a peace that France could accept without burning for revenge. But he was overruled by military considerations and political pressure. The German generals insisted that Alsace-Lorraine's fortifications at Metz and Strasbourg were essential for defending Germany's western frontier against future French attack. The newly unified German states demanded visible fruits of victory, and Wilhelm I wanted the territory as much for symbolic reasons as strategic ones, just to demonstrate that the new German Empire could reshape the map of Europe through military force. The annexation creates exactly the problem Bismarck feared. France does not accept the loss. How could it? Alsace and Lorraine have been French territories for 2 centuries, since the Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War. The population, though largely German-speaking, has developed a French political identity, voting for French Republican candidates, participating in French political life. The 1871 elections in the region show overwhelming opposition to annexation. When German rule is imposed, approximately 150,000 Alsatians and Lorrainers emigrate rather than become German subjects. Those who remain constitute a permanent problem for German administration. A population that considers itself occupied rather than annexed, French rather than German. In France, the loss becomes the defining trauma of a generation. School children are taught never to forget the lost provinces, which appear on maps colored in black, a visual reminder of national mourning. The female allegories of Alsace and Lorraine, known as the Twin Sisters, appear on posters, in newspapers, in political cartoons, embodying the territories that must be recovered. The revanchist movement, from the French word for revenge, makes the recovery of Alsace-Lorraine its central demand. Politicians like Georges Clemenceau oppose colonial expansion in Africa and Asia because it distracts from the essential objective, what he calls the blue line of the Vosges, the mountains that mark the border between France and the annexed territories. The demand for revanche, for revenge, and territorial recovery becomes woven into French political culture. Yet historians who examine French politics in the decades after 1871 note something curious. While the rhetoric of revenge remains constant, actual French policy is notably cautious. The revanchists never control the government. French military planning after 1871 is defensive, designed to prevent another German invasion, rather than to prepare an offensive war to recover the lost provinces. When the nationalist general Boulanger appears to threaten a coup in 1887, promising war to recover Alsace-Lorraine, the Republican establishment moves against him and he flees into exile. By 1914, most French politicians understand that Alsace-Lorraine can be recovered only if Germany suffers military defeat, and they are not eager to start a war for that purpose. The wound Bismarck created in 1871 does not, by itself, cause the First World War, but it ensures that when war comes for other reasons, France will fight with an enthusiasm born of seeing an opportunity to right a 43-year-old wrong. The second element of Bismarck's legacy is the alliance system he constructs to manage the consequences of German unification. His fundamental strategic problem is clear. Germany sits in the center of Europe, surrounded by potential enemies. France burns for revenge. Russia wants influence in the Balkans. Austria-Hungary fears Russian expansion. Britain watches nervously as German industrial and military power grows. Bismarck's nightmare is what he calls a coalition of powers forming against Germany, what later strategists will call encirclement, forcing Germany to fight enemies on multiple fronts simultaneously. Everything he does after 1871 is designed to prevent this outcome. The system he builds is extraordinarily complex, a web of overlapping and sometimes contradictory commitments that only Bismarck fully understands. The Dreikaiserbund, the League of the Three Emperors, links Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia in 1873 in a loose understanding to consult before acting. When that collapses after the Congress of Berlin in 1878, where Russia feels betrayed by Bismarck's mediation, he negotiates the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary in 1879. There's a formal military pact that remains in effect until 1918. When Italy fears French expansion, he brings it into the Triple Alliance in 1882. When Russia demands reassurance, he negotiates the secret reinsurance treaty in 1887, promising German neutrality if Russia is attacked by a third power. He maintains informal understandings with Britain through the Mediterranean agreements. He keeps channels open to all the major powers, ensuring that Germany has influence everywhere and that no coalition can form against it. The genius of the system is its flexibility. Bismarck does not seek rigid commitments. He wants enough entanglement with each power to prevent it from allying with Germany's enemies, but not so much entanglement that Germany is pulled into conflicts that do not serve its interests. Where he maintains the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary while simultaneously maintaining the reinsurance treaty with Russia, even though the two commitments technically contradict each other. He can manage this contradiction because he understands the limits of each treaty, knows that the dual alliance obligates Germany to fight only if Russia attacks Austria, knows that the reinsurance treaty obligates Germany to neutrality only if a third power attacks Russia. As long as neither Austria nor Russia starts a war with the other, both treaties can coexist. And Bismarck ensures that neither starts such a war by using his influence in both capitals to restrain both sides during Balkan crises. The system works for nearly 2 decades. From 1871 to 1890, Europe experiences no wars between great powers. The Balkans see several crises that might have escalated into general war but do not, precisely because Bismarck's diplomatic machinery contains them. The war scare of 1875 provides an early test. German newspapers begin discussing the possibility of a preventive war against France, whose military recovery after the defeat of 1871 alarms the General Staff. France appeals to Russia and Britain, both of which make clear they would not remain neutral in such a conflict. Bismarck quickly disavows any intention of attacking France, using the crisis to demonstrate that Germany seeks peace and that other powers overreact to German strength. The message is calculated: Germany is powerful but not aggressive, and attempts to isolate it diplomatically will fail because Germany maintains good relations with all the major powers. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 prevents a war over Russia's gains from the Ottoman Empire. Russia has just fought and won the Russo-Turkish War, imposing the Treaty of San Stefano that would create a large Bulgarian state under Russian influence. Austria-Hungary and Britain object vehemently, seeing the treaty as an unacceptable expansion of Russian power. War between Austria-Hungary and Russia seems imminent. Bismarck offers to mediate, describing himself as an honest broker who has no interest in Balkan territory and wants only to preserve European peace. Over 7 weeks of negotiations in Berlin, he orchestrates a compromise. Russia keeps some of its gains but surrenders others. Austria-Hungary is allowed to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina. Britain secures Cyprus. The great powers accept a settlement that prevents war but satisfies no one completely. Russia feels betrayed by Bismarck's mediation, believing the honest broker favored Austrian and British interests over Russian ones. The Congress plants seeds of Russo-German mistrust that Bismarck spends the next 9 years trying to overcome. The Bulgarian crisis of 1885 to 1887 is even more dangerous. Prince Alexander of Battenberg, installed as Bulgaria's ruler with Russian support, asserts independence from St. Petersburg's control. When Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia unite without Russian permission, the Tsar is furious. Russian agents organize a coup, Austrian and Russian interests collide, and for months, Europe teeters on the edge of war between the two Eastern empires. Bismarck refuses to take sides, making clear to both Vienna and St. Petersburg that Germany will not fight a war over Bulgaria. He tells the Austrians privately that the Balkans are not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. He tells the Russians privately that he understands their interests in the region. Most importantly, he makes clear to both that if they go to war, Germany will not join either side, which means both will face the conflict alone without German support. This threat of abandonment restrains both powers. The crisis is resolved without war, though at the cost of the Dreikaiserbund's collapse. Bismarck replaces it with the Reinsurance Treaty, maintaining the link to Russia through different means. Through all of this, as Bismarck demonstrates the principles that make his system work. First, Germany must not be seen as the aggressor or as seeking territorial expansion. Second, all parties must believe Germany has influence with their rivals, making Germany's friendship valuable. Third, crises must be managed through negotiation rather than allowed to escalate to military confrontation. Fourth, commitments must be limited enough that Germany retains freedom of action, but substantial enough that other powers see value in German alignment. These principles require constant attention, personal relationships with foreign leaders, understanding of what each power actually wants beneath its public demands, and willingness to adjust tactics when circumstances change. They cannot be reduced to rules that any competent diplomat can follow. They require genius, and genius cannot be institutionalized. The Bulgarian crisis of 1885 to 1887 is managed without the Austro-Russian conflict that seems inevitable. France remains isolated, unable to find the Eastern ally. It needs to dare challenge Germany again. Russia, reassured by the reinsurance treaty, has no reason to seek French partnership. Britain, focused on its empire and on colonial rivalries with France and Russia, does not concern itself with continental alliances. Bismarck has created what one historian calls a saturated Europe, a continent where the major powers are sufficiently entangled with each other and with Germany that no one dares upset the balance. But the system has a fatal flaw. It requires Bismarck. The contradictions that he manages through personal skill, through his understanding of what each power actually wants, through his willingness to lie to some parties about his commitments to others, cannot be managed by anyone with ordinary diplomatic ability. Bismarck knows this. In his last years in office, he grows increasingly concerned about what will happen when he is gone. He sees no one in the German foreign ministry with the skill to maintain what he has built. He worries particularly about Friedrich von Holstein, the brilliant but paranoid official who serves as political director, who understands the mechanics of the system but not its spirit, who sees contradictions where Bismarck sees complementarities. When Bismarck is dismissed in March 1890, the system begins to unravel almost immediately. His successor, Leo von Caprivi, is a capable administrator but no diplomat. Caprivi listens to Holstein, who argues that the reinsurance treaty with Russia is incompatible with the dual alliance with Austria, that maintaining both simultaneously damages German credibility, that the treaty should not be renewed when it expires in June 1890. Kaiser Wilhelm II accepts this reasoning, confident that his personal friendship with Tsar Alexander III makes the treaty unnecessary. When Russia requests renewal, Germany declines. The refusal is polite, even friendly, but it is a refusal nonetheless. Russia, suddenly without German reassurance, finds itself vulnerable. It faces the Austro-German dual alliance to the west. It has colonial rivalries with Britain in Central Asia. Its security depends on having some counterweight to the hostile or potentially hostile powers surrounding it. France, wealthy and eager for an ally, offers what Russia needs. Despite ideological differences, despite Tsar Alexander's deep conservatism and personal distaste for French republicanism, Russia and France begin the courtship that leads to the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894. What Bismarck spent his career preventing has happened within 4 years of his dismissal. France has found its eastern ally. Germany faces the prospect of a two-front war. Wilhelm and his advisors do not immediately understand what they have done. The Franco-Russian alliance is initially seen in Berlin as a minor irritant rather than a strategic catastrophe. After all, Germany still has the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary and Italy. Germany's army is larger and better trained than the French or Russian armies individually. The General Staff, led by Alfred von Schlieffen, begins developing plans for how Germany might fight a two-front war if necessary, calculating that rapid mobilization and the superior German railway system can allow Germany to knock out France quickly before turning east against the slower mobilizing Russians. The Schlieffen Plan, refined over the next 2 decades, becomes the operational response to the strategic problem that Bismarck's diplomacy was designed to prevent. But the plan contains its own fatal flaw. It requires violating Belgian neutrality. The quickest route from Germany to Paris runs through Belgium, and the Schlieffen Plan calls for German armies to sweep through Belgium and northern France in a great wheeling movement that will encircle Paris and force French surrender within 6 weeks. But Belgium's neutrality has been guaranteed by the great powers, including Britain, since 1839. If Germany invades Belgium, Britain will almost certainly intervene. The military plan designed to solve the problem of a two-front war therefore risks creating a three-front war, adding British power to the Franco-Russian combination. The German General Staff dismisses this risk, calculating that British military contribution will be negligible, that the war will be over before British power can be brought to bear. This calculation, like so many made after Bismarck's departure, will prove catastrophically wrong. The years between 1890 and 1914 see Germany's international position steadily deteriorate. Wilhelm pursues what he calls Weltpolitik, world policy, demanding that Germany's global presence match its industrial might. He builds a high-seas fleet designed to challenge British naval supremacy, alarming London and pushing Britain toward France. The Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, where Germany attempts to break up the Anglo-French Entente by challenging French influence in Morocco, only strengthen the relationship Germany sought to destroy. By 1907, Britain has settled its colonial disputes with Russia as well as with France, and the Triple Entente is complete. Europe has organized itself into two armed camps: the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on one side, the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain on the other. The flexible, asymmetric system that Bismarck maintained has been replaced by rigid confrontation. The rigidity proves fatal when tested in July 1914. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo creates the kind of Balkan crisis that Bismarck managed repeatedly without general war. But the mechanisms for managing such crises no longer exist. Germany has no back channel to Russia, no reassurance to offer that it understands Russian interests in the Balkans and will restrain Austria-Hungary. The crisis unfolds with a terrible momentum that seems unstoppable once it begins. On June 28, 1914, Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist, shoots Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. The assassination is the work of the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist organization with ties to Serbian military intelligence. Austria-Hungary, which has annexed Bosnia in 1908 over Serbian protests, sees the assassination as proof that Serbia must be crushed before Serb nationalism destroys the multinational empire. But Austria-Hungary cannot move against Serbia without German support. If Russia intervenes to protect Serbia, Austria-Hungary needs Germany at its side. On July 5th, Germany provides the infamous blank check. Kaiser Wilhelm and Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg assure Austrian officials that Germany will support whatever action Austria-Hungary decides to take against Serbia, even if it means war with Russia. This is the crucial decision, the moment when Germany abandons the Bismarckian principle of maintaining influence in both Vienna and St. Petersburg to restrain both sides. Instead, Germany unconditionally backs one side, giving Austria-Hungary the confidence to issue demands that Serbia cannot possibly accept. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary delivers an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding not just punishment of those involved in the assassination, but effective Serbian submission to Austrian oversight, including Austrian participation in the investigation on Serbian soil. Serbia's acceptance of nearly all terms is dismissed as insufficient. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia, which sees itself as the protector of Slavic peoples in the Balkans, cannot stand aside while Austria-Hungary crushes Serbia. On July 30th, despite knowing that mobilization means war, Tsar Nicholas II orders general mobilization. The Russian military has no plan for partial mobilization. No way to threaten Austria-Hungary without also threatening Germany. Once the mobilization begins, the machinery of war takes over. Germany, facing the specter of the two-front war that Bismarck spent his career preventing, issues ultimatums to Russia and France, demanding that they cease military preparations. When the ultimatums expire unanswered, Germany declares war on Russia on August 1st and on France on August 3rd. German armies cross into Belgium on August 4th. Britain, honoring its guarantee of Belgian neutrality and fearing German domination of the continent, declares war on Germany. Within 37 days of the shots in Sarajevo, Europe is at war. Austria-Hungary, emboldened by German support and convinced that Serbian-sponsored terrorism threatens its existence as a multinational empire, issues an ultimatum to Serbia so harsh that acceptance is nearly impossible. Russia, bound by pan-Slavic sentiment and its alliance with France to support Serbia, mobilizes. Germany, facing the nightmare of a two-front war, implements the Schlieffen Plan. Belgium is invaded. Britain declares war. Within 6 weeks of the assassination, Europe is engulfed in a conflict that will kill 17 million people and destroy the world Bismarck knew. So is Bismarck responsible? The question admits no simple answer. He did not start the war. He was dead for 16 years before it began. He explicitly warned against the two-front war that Germany fought. He would have been horrified by the destruction of the European order he spent his life maintaining. Yet the elements of his legacy, the decisions he made and the systems he created, helped shape the path to 1914. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine created permanent Franco-German hostility, ensuring that France would seize any opportunity to recover the lost provinces and would prosecute any war against Germany with an enthusiasm born of 43 years of resentment. The decision to take those provinces was not solely Bismarck's. He was pressured by the military and by public opinion, but he accepted it and built his subsequent diplomacy around managing its consequences. Had Germany offered a more moderate peace in 1871, one that preserved French territorial integrity while still demonstrating German military superiority, the entire trajectory of Franco-German relations might have been different. France might have reconciled itself to German power without the burning grievance that poisoned relations for 2 generations. The alliance system Bismarck built kept the peace brilliantly during his tenure, but it was too dependent on his personal skill to survive his departure. He created a system that only a genius could operate, and he knew that his successors were not geniuses. A more robust system, simpler and more transparent, might have served Germany better after his departure. But simplicity and transparency were not Bismarck's way. He believed in complexity, in managing contradictions, in keeping all parties slightly uncertain of where they stood. This approach worked under his direction. Under the direction of lesser men, it collapsed into confusion and then into rigid alliance blocks that made war more rather than less likely. The dismissal of Bismarck in 1890 was not Bismarck's fault, but the way he had concentrated power in his own hands made that dismissal particularly catastrophic. He had built a system that could not function without him, had trained no successors capable of understanding what he had built, had jealously guarded his diplomatic secrets to the point that even his own foreign ministry did not fully understand German commitments. When he fell, he took with him the institutional knowledge that made the system work. Caprivi and Holstein were not stupid men. They made decisions that seemed rational based on the information they had and the principles they believed in. But they lacked Bismarck's understanding of the system's logic, and so they dismantled it without fully grasping what they were destroying. Yet to place all responsibility on Bismarck is to absolve too many others of their share of guilt. Wilhelm II chose to let the reinsurance treaty lapse. Tirpitz chose to build a navy that alienated Britain. Bethmann-Hollweg chose to give Austria-Hungary the blank check in July 1914. Moltke the Younger chose to implement the Schlieffen Plan even when its political consequences were becoming clear. The men who governed Germany after Bismarck made their own decisions, pursued their own policies, created their own catastrophes. They cannot hide behind the claim that Bismarck's legacy forced their hands, and beyond Germany, responsibility extends to every power that participated in the destruction of European peace. Austria-Hungary chose to issue an ultimatum to Serbia that was designed to be rejected. Russia chose to mobilize, knowing that mobilization meant war. France honored its alliance commitment, knowing it would mean war. Britain declared war over Belgian neutrality when it might have chosen to interpret its obligations more narrowly. The outbreak of war in 1914 was not inevitable, was not the automatic working of impersonal forces, but the result of dozens of decisions made by hundreds of people in the crisis summer of that year. Bismarck's shadow falls across those decisions, but it does not determine them. Thus, the tragedy is that Bismarck understood better than any of his contemporaries or successors what Germany needed to survive and prosper in the heart of Europe. He understood that Germany was too strong to be ignored and too weak to dominate, that its security depended on maintaining a balance among its neighbors rather than seeking supremacy over them. He understood that alliances should be flexible instruments of policy rather than rigid commitments that constrain freedom of action. He understood that war, though sometimes necessary, was always dangerous and should be undertaken only with clear objectives and careful preparation. Above all, he understood that the map of Europe he had redrawn through 3 wars in the 1860s was as much as Germany could safely digest. That further expansion would create more enemies than Germany could manage. His successors understood none of this. They saw Germany as a rising power that deserved its place in the sun, that should not be constrained by the caution of an old man from a previous generation. They pursued Weltpolitik when Germany needed saturation policy. They built a navy when Germany needed to avoid alienating Britain. They gave unconditional support to Austria-Hungary when Germany needed to maintain influence in both Vienna and St. Petersburg. They implemented war plans that required violating neutral territory when Germany needed to avoid expanding the number of its enemies. Every decision made sense in isolation, based on immediate considerations and narrow calculations. But cumulatively, those decisions led Germany and Europe toward catastrophe. In his final years at Friedrichsruhe, Bismarck watched this unfolding with a mixture of bitterness and resignation. He knew what was coming. He told anyone who would listen that one day the great European war would come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. He revealed the existence of the reinsurance treaty in 1896, hoping that public knowledge of what had been discarded would force reconsideration of the policy direction Germany was taking. He criticized Wilhelm's navy building, the confrontational approach to Britain and Russia, the abandonment of the careful diplomacy that had kept Europe at peace. He was ignored. The old man ranting from his estate was yesterday's news. Germany was moving forward, and there was no room for nostalgia. When Bismarck died in July 1898, Germany mourned him with genuine emotion. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary Germans had made pilgrimages to Friedrichsruhe to shake his hand. Nearly 500 Bismarck towers were built or under construction across Germany, monuments funded by popular subscription. The man who unified Germany was revered as the founding father of the nation, but the policies he advocated were ignored. His warnings were dismissed. The system he built was gone, replaced by something harder, more brittle, more prone to catastrophic failure. 16 years later, in the summer of 1914, that failure came. Whether Bismarck bears responsibility depends on how one assigns causation in history. Did his decision to annex Alsace-Lorraine make Franco-German reconciliation impossible, and thereby ensure France would fight enthusiastically in 1914? Possibly. Did his construction of an alliance system too complex for lesser men to manage make its collapse inevitable when he departed? Arguably. Did his success in using war as an instrument of policy encourage his successors to believe they could do the same with similar success? Perhaps, but these are questions of indirect causation, of creating conditions rather than making decisions. The men who actually started the First World War, who made the choices in July 1914 that transformed a Balkan crisis into a global catastrophe, bear direct responsibility in a way that Bismarck does not. But the fairest judgment might be this: Bismarck created a German empire that was powerful enough to threaten its neighbors, but not powerful enough to dominate them, in a strategic position that made conflict likely unless managed with extraordinary skill, with territorial grievances that ensured permanent French hostility, and with an alliance system that worked brilliantly under genius direction but collapsed under ordinary management. He did not make the First World War inevitable, but he created some of the conditions that made it possible. And when the war came, it came in large part because the men who followed him lacked his understanding that Germany's power was limited, that European peace required constant diplomatic effort, that the map he had redrawn in the 1870s was as much as Germany could safely hold. That they reached for more, and in reaching, they pulled down everything Bismarck had built and plunged Europe into catastrophe.